Welcome to the AI and Faith podcast. We are a community of expert technologists, professionals, and faith leaders bringing the ancient wisdom of the world's major religions to the ethics of artificial intelligence. Join us on this new journey and welcome to the conversation.
I think on the one hand, it's amazing. I mean, they're already, Safaria is a database of Jewish texts. It's growing by the day, and it's starting to employ AI in a slow way and in a considered way. And I think it's an incredible resource. We're all getting more educated, and that's an incredible thing.
Welcome. My name is Gilad Berenstein, and thank you so much for joining us for another episode of the AI and Faith podcast. On this podcast, we're bringing conversations and insight from our experts around the world and friends of the community so we can all think about AI and build a world together that brings AI for the common good. I'm thrilled to be joined by our guest today, who is a brilliant AI and faith expert with deep expertise in both AI, philosophy, and the law. And he also happens to be a rabbi. So there's a lot we can learn from him. So let me welcome our guest for joining us. Thank you so much, Harris, for joining us. And please take a second to introduce yourself.
It's a pleasure. Well, my name's Harris Bohr. I'm a lawyer. That's my day job. But I also have a background in academia. That's something that I always wanted to be, was a professor. I started off looking at religious intellectual history, particularly Judaism, and then got more interested in theology as I went along doing my day job as a barrister, a trial lawyer, and completed a PhD and also a rabbinic ordination, Orthodox ordination called Smicha, and then wrote a book in which I put AI in the title. It's actually a book about Jewish theology, and having done that, it's brought me into contact with lots of people in this field and got me into a whole new area.
Amazing. And maybe just tell us just a bit about the book.
Well, the book is called Staying Human, a Jewish theology for the age of artificial intelligence, and it really explores two thinkers, but looking at them through a Jewish lens. And these two thinkers are Spinoza, and Benedict Spinoza, and Martin Heidegger. I kind of look at them in relation to this idea of the singularity as put forward by Ray Kurzweil a while ago in his book, The Singularity is Near. And I kind of asked myself the question whether this idea of the singularity, in which Kurzweil describes artificial intelligence taking over the entire universe, as being whether that's a good idea or a bad idea, and how that relates to God. So that's what my book's about, and it really is just a starting point, I feel.
Absolutely, and we're going to get back to that in a second. But going back to the top, my first question is really, why AI? Someone like yourself, a real polymath with so many different skills and interests, how did you become interested in AI, and why are you choosing to spend time here versus all the other areas?
Yeah, well, as I say, it's something of an accident, but actually it does bring together lots of things which I've been interested in. The one thing that really grabs me about AI is how it really isn't just about technology and making things happen or making things more efficient, but actually brings us head up close to the big questions of life. What is it that makes us human? How does our thinking differ from artificial intelligence? How do we preserve that humanity? Do we really want to live forever? This is the transhumanist kind of question. What do we want to do all day when AI does everything for us and solves all our problems? And what is consciousness and sentience? So these are really deep issues, and AI brings it all together, along with the kind of very practical interest that I have in law and try to make society a better place.
Yeah, I love that. And there's so much I want to dig into there, but I want to ask you one question before I go back to the big picture. How do you think about the difference between consciousness and sentience? That's something I think a lot about. And I wonder if you have a perspective there.
Go on, you tell me yours first, and then I'll come back to you.
Absolutely. And I don't know if mine is in any way accurate or not, but I think of consciousness as really simple, the ability to have an experience, the fact that it is like something to be alive or to be in existence. Whereas I think of sentience a lot more as directed intelligence. And of course, there's a clear overlap in the Venn diagram, because like something is directing at that instinct to direct it is coming from somewhere. At least in humans, it comes from consciousness. But I think about them as kind of overlap, but a bit distinct from one another. And I often tell audiences that I think it's very, very likely that AI is or soon will be sentient, but I have absolutely no perspective of AI will ever be conscious.
Yes. Well, I really like that distinction. I buy it wholeheartedly. I think it's a very good distinction to make. And I mean, panpsychists, of course, will think that everything has some kind of sense of what it's like to be that particular thing. But the trouble with this is, of course, it's very hard to get underneath the hood in terms of anything. But one thing I think we do need to be careful of is thinking that everything is exactly like we are.
Absolutely.
Both in terms of other human beings, but also in terms of humans and other things. And what we could be looking at is a kind of distinct category which we haven't actually encountered before, which is neither object nor human. And it's that kind of space which is interesting to me, and also thinking about how we deal and the kind of rights that we offer the being that inhabits that area.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to have you back for an episode with a few of our experts to talk about just this. I mean, this is an area that is an incredibly deep interest and passion for me. And of course, I think there's a lot of ethics that flows from whether an entity has consciousness or not. But before we get too deep, I do want to go back to the big picture. So we heard a little bit about how you got into AI. And then my next question is, of course, the world of AI has changed a lot over the last 3 years. I refer to this era of AI as a great commoditization. And I give a lot of speeches in the corporate setting, trying to tell audiences this is not really about Gen AI. Gen AI is a cool new tool, a cool new capability. But the real change we're going through is this great commoditization. And it really seems to me it's a totally different technology epoch than even the AI we were using 7 or 8 years ago. So I'm curious if and how your perspective on AI and its role in the world has changed since the great commoditization began about 3.5 years ago.
I look at this through the eyes of the average person. I see myself not as a technologist, but really just as a user. And so as a user, what one finds is one's confronted with this all the time now, much more. I mean, even my WhatsApp, for example, last Friday I think it was, where Meta's sort of assistant suddenly appears, and there's this great push to what's called sort of agentic AI, which is all new, and you see this being used more and more. For example, you have meetings where people show up and they'll not show up, in fact, but send their AI agent to do the listening and the note taking. But then what happens next? Does the AI agent start piping up and making points on behalf of the principal that sent them? So these are huge changes. Plus, I would say the use of decision making in AI. In other words, recruitment, insurance, and the like, something which I don't think people are always aware of. And then again, the use of or taking of our information, use of that information, and how that's being used and sold and exploited. Again, I don't think people are particularly au fait with all of that. And I think these are huge changes.
Absolutely. And as I tell audiences in both corporate and non-corporate settings, we all have to engage in this conversation because it's going to change our lives and our world. So my last question, kind of this opening segment, is I'm curious if you're an AI optimist or a pessimist or something in between.
I think overall I'm an optimist, and I feel like I have to be, because I think the alternative is too horrible to comprehend.
Yeah.
And I think part of that is wanting to do something about it, because I do think the way AI turns out will have a lot to do with how the public as a whole, society, sort of engage in this. And if we just sit back and allow ourselves to be taken over, as it were, then I think things could end quite badly. With if there's no brakes and there's no checks and balances imposed. On the other hand, if actually we make demands in terms of what we want, the red lines we're not willing to step over, what we think will elevate us and make us better human beings, and the developers buy into that, and we share that, and we have that conversation, and I think things could go quite well. I mean, we may, I should say, get into a stage where we have good AI fighting bad AI, but I think overall, the good should win out.
Absolutely. I think it's actually indisputable that we will have bad AI and good AI, even though, of course, I don't love the word good and bad, but nonetheless, there will absolutely be conflicting AIs. I think we're already seeing that in national security and in military affairs. We're going to see that in a lot more in corporate affairs as well. So switching gears, or kind of really building on that more accurately, I want to talk a bit about politics and policy. And, I have the perspective, and I'm sure you share with me based on the comments you just made, that we kind of have to get this right. And if we don't get this right, there's a lot of other important conversations we're having that actually won't matter if we don't have a world that is dominated by humans and human ideas, and instead have a world that's dominated by AI and artificial intelligence ideas. You're connected to a lot of politicians and thought leaders out there. So my first question, when you speak to politicians and policymakers, how much do they know about AI? Are they positive? Are they negative? What's their take on it?
I mean, what I'm finding in engaging with British parliamentarians is that some of them do have great knowledge and experience, indeed, within the technological world. The greater challenge is persuading the government to actually implement something and
Yeah.
bring about these changes. And I think there is a sense within government that you don't want to stifle innovation. And that's the big question, I suppose, is will regulation, increased regulation, stifle innovation? And that's the big question for government, rather than do we need this to protect us? I do think there are members of parliament, at least here, who are concerned about the lack of regulation in this
Yeah.
country. I mean, there's more regulation around this sandwich on my desk than there is around AI. And that's not true necessarily in Europe. For example, there's a new EU AI Act, which goes quite a long way to dealing with some of the issues, perhaps not as far as some would want it. But we don't have anything yet in this like that in this country. And it's the problem, of course, is very slow implementing legislation. And also
Yeah.
then you're dealing with such a fast-paced industry. How does one allow for change within a sort of regulatory context? And
Yeah.
that's really, really tricky. The kind of issues that come up a lot of things like facial recognition software, which is used by police and often leads to wrongful arrests, bias, transparency, sort of the usual topics that we all hear about. And I don't think we've really got to the bottom of it. I mean, the issue around creators and copyright as well is one that one sees in all countries at the moment too. And there's the whole discussion about opt-in rights or opt-out rights.
No, that's a really complicated topic. I gave a number of talks in LA during the writer's strike a year and a half ago. And as you can imagine, after my talk, the very first question was always about this kind of ownership and IP protection. And it's one of those questions that I've talked to some politicians in the United States about as well. And I always say it's incredibly difficult because on one hand, if we look at human intelligence, every author has read thousands of books and been inspired by them. Every painter has seen thousands of paintings and been inspired by them. And none of us have a concern of that, right? The bar for plagiarism is pretty darn high for us to say it was plagiarized and not inspired by. Whereas for AI, we feel different. And I feel different too. It's not just like other people feel different. I also feel different. But as I tell the audience, we have to come up with some sort of a principled argument, a line of why it is that humans learning from other things is okay, whereas at least some of us feel like AI learning from other things is not okay. And I find that to be a really complicated conversation with a lot of stakeholders. So when you speak to these legislatures and policymakers, what are they asking you about? And really what I'm trying to get to is, what do they care about?
I think they want to know what civil society requires from legislation. What kind of protections do people want? And that goes to then issues of how much are we willing to give up in terms of our personal information? How much in terms of decision making are we willing to allow to an AI? And particularly in that context, are there red lines? In other words, are there areas which we will say, look, we do not want AIs to make decisions about this type of thing? For example, let's say law or end of life medical care. Are these areas which the public will say, look, we do not want AI being utilized in that context? And you hear this phrase, a human in the loop. The big problem is that it's not always possible to have a human in the loop.
Yeah.
And if you think about, Twitter and checking, for example, for abusive tweets, how many millions there are each day, it's not possible for people to deal with those, or healthy, in fact.
Well, I mean, and actually counteract some of the value. I mean, if I think about it in a corporate setting, one of the values of AI is efficiency and speed. So if you now have to wait for a human employee in the loop, you actually lost one of the main value propositions of adopting AI in the first place. Yeah, the balancing act is incredibly difficult. I find that this comes up a lot in conversation around sustainability. And most people at this point know that the amount of electricity to do a GPT chat search, for example, is significantly higher than to do a Google search. This conflicting thing, because on one hand, I tell people all the time, you have to use AI, you have to build an internal knowledge and awareness of it to be able to keep up with the conversation. But on the other hand, I care deeply for sustainability as well. And I don't want you to use something that takes eight times as much electricity to do the same thing. And I find that there are many of these kind of contradictions and difficult balancing acts across the AI world.
Yes.
Now, another question about the politicians and legislatures you meet with that's come up to me a lot in other conversations is, who's around them? And I have to say, personally, I'm feeling a little bit better knowing that you're around them. But in addition to yourself, like, are they being surrounded by academics, by entrepreneurs, by maybe more skeptical, concerned people? Who's around the politicians?
My understanding is that the people who are mostly around politicians are lobbyists on behalf of big developer technology companies, and that their resources cannot really be matched. Of course, these are almost like country city states, so it's very difficult to match them. However, I do think that there is a push for more engagement with academics, more research into the effects of certain AI, the impact on certain AI on society as well, and there's push towards that. And I think there is some interest within having discussions with faith as well as general civil society, because an understanding that actually a lot of these questions, the underlying big questions, and indeed some of these ethical questions, have been grappled with by faith and religion for millennia. And indeed, in fact, I think something like 80% of the world claim to have some kind of faith background.
Yeah, no, I think that that's ultimately what brings us all to AI and faith as well. And our audience keeps coming back to the podcast because we also believe in this pluralist, diverse perspective that's so important. Because it's interesting, I'll tell you, in the United States, and I'm not nearly as close with legislatures here as you are with the ones in the UK, but it seems to me like the people that are talking to them are of extremes. On one hand, they're lobbyists for Facebook, and most people already know this. Facebook has more lobbyists than all the members of Congress put together. And they, of course, have one perspective. And it's not, I'm picking on Facebook, it's true for all the big tech companies. And on the other hand, they're hearing from real skeptics or people with real fear and anxiety about AI. And often it feels like I really want them to hear from people like yourself, from people that are kind of in the middle who see the upside. As Yuval Noah Harari always reminds audiences, we wouldn't have to have this conversation if there weren't enormous upsides to adoption of AI in the world and in society. But anyways, I find that they're kind of stuck between these extremes that makes it really hard for them to come up with a middle of the road solution. And I don't envy them in this difficult task they have.
Well, I think these extremes are very useful in some senses to the tech people, because they're kind of easy. It's easy to push against extremes. And sometimes what you hear in terms of a feeling of skepticism when tech companies talk about existential risk, is kind of kicking the can down the road to some future date and not really dealing with the real issues of bias and transparency and the rest of it right now. So there's that kind of question as well.
Absolutely. And then I guess my last question about this topic here, and I maybe already know the answer, but do you find that most of them are more on the optimistic side of the ledger or on more of the scared, pessimistic side of the ledger?
I think it's really neatly divided. And I talk in quite a lot of places. I've been in quite a few panels recently, and these questions are always asked to the audience. And I do find it kind of divides very neatly. There's not normally one or the other. And that's across the board.
And have you found that tech sophistication amongst legislatures has grown the last few years? Certainly in the United States, many people have the memory of Zuckerberg being asked what their business model was, seared into their memory. And obviously that was fair to criticize the legislatures then. In my experience, a lot of them have learned a lot over the last 5 or 6 years.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, I'm not being a technologist myself. I'm not in a great position to judge on that, but I do get the sense that they are much more sophisticated now. And of course, you've several of these summits. You've had a summit in the UK. I'm going to talk about the European, the summit in the UK and the summit in France as well. And so, there's certainly a high level of engagement there.
So now, of course, I want to dive into religion, and specifically by thinking about it through the singularity, which is the topic that both of us are interested in. So maybe just to start, maybe you can define that for the audience who are not familiar with the term. What is the singularity?
Well, the singularity is considered to be this point in time where we lose control in terms of artificial intelligence. In other words, it's the point of no return. And it's also a point associated with greater degree of sophistication. So if we think about AI as being designed to do a particular role or series of roles or jobs, one can contrast that with AGI, which is artificial general intelligence, whereby AI can, as you say, is almost like an independent being and kind of go off on its own and do its own things, albeit can be directed in a particular area. And then you have, I guess, another stage, which is ASI, which is artificial superintelligence, whereby AI surpasses humans in every single domain. And people, as I mentioned, talk about us edging closer towards these things. And Ray Kurzweil, in his book, The Singularity is Near, goes further and talks about AI or this superintelligence taking over the entire universe and just spreading ever outwards. I mean, incidentally, he's just published very recently another book called The Singularity is Nearer, the sequel. And he thinks these things are just around the corner. I think it's 2029 for AGI, and then 45 for this greater point.
And I would say, like, the one thing I'll add to it is I think one of the elements of the singularity, which is probably near, is AI's ability to build other AIs. As I think about it, when that begins to happen, that really brings us a lot closer to it. So I guess my next question, I've already shared my bias here. Do you think we're actually getting close to the singularity? And like, what would it look like? How would we know once it started, or would we not know for a while after it started?
Yeah, I mean, but on the technological side, I'm not going to be able to really answer that question. And I think the only thing I have to go on is what I'm being told by the tech bros, and what they're saying is that we are edging closer to that. But then we've heard lots of these kind of things, predictions in the past, so we may
Absolutely.
not be. I mean, I'm actually more interested in it as a concept because it's so fascinating to me that people have been got intoxicated for since the birth of humankind, and they still are, but in a different sort of way. And we kind of killed God,
Yeah.
to use Nietzsche's term, but yeah, we've kind of resurrected God in the form of technology. When I say we, I mean, I don't mean everybody, I mean certain individuals. And Kurzweil's vision or fantasy even is a good example of that. I mean, there's an article which appeared in Vox magazine, I think just a couple of days ago, with a heading, Will AI Become God? Where Yaron Lanier, a digital philosopher, was talking about this concept and how developers almost make this into a kind of aim when they're developing. They want AI to be cleverer and cleverer. And he's really warning and saying, look, that shouldn't really be the aim, because it makes it harder for us to critique AI when you think of it in these terms.
Yeah.
And it also makes AI as an end in itself. It's almost like you're creating AI to be godlike rather than to actually help human beings, which what it should be doing. These things are really, really out there. And he suggests there's a lot of people, who hold these views.
Yeah, absolutely. And you took this exactly where I was hoping to go with the conversation. So we talked about one side. So my question was going to be is like bringing God into this. How are God and AI related? And you talked about one side, which is people building AIs and thinking of them more God-like, but as a completely separate entity from God. The other side of it is people bringing it into established religions as almost a part of their religion, as almost a way to get closer to God in some fashion. And I'm curious, kind of like if you've seen anything on that other side, and if you see that as a positive, as a negative.
Oh, that's a great question. I haven't actually seen it, but I do understand that there are groups out there who kind of follow this line. I remember there was an
Yeah,
article, I think, in Wired from 2017, Lewandowski, who was saying that AI is, so clever and godlike. Of course, it should be worshipped. I mean, I haven't seen, anything within my own religion, within Judaism, in terms of people wanting to worship this AI. And in fact, I would suggest that there may well be ideas or concepts within Judaism, for example, which would push back against that. And if I can just expand upon that, I mean, you do have particularly within the mystical tradition, a very strong sense that there is only God, there's nothing else. And so there's this kind of oneness or nothing else kind of
yeah.
outlook on life. But there's also a flip side, and that is is or should be a kind of minority interest. And ultimately, we live in this world of separation and divide, whereas where we're over here and God is somewhere else. That's kind of transcendence, and that kind of model applies to our relationship with other people. Other people and ourselves. Yes, we may well be connected on some fundamental level, but actually we should engage with each other distinctly as separate beings and allow them to exist in their separateness. And so the model, of the relationship between us and God is the same. And there's a kind of movement between these two modes, this mode of immanence where God is everything, and this transcendence. Both are characterized by, I suppose, an ethical striving. So taking just those two ideas, and I haven't gone into everything, and applying that to the AI scenario, you can see how it differs. Firstly, the technological God doesn't depend on any kind of ethics. It's just a technological fix. Let's
Yeah.
create this thing which will solve all our problems. Plus, there's none of this movement between immanence and transcendence. And therefore, what is at risk is relationship to everything that's out there and relationship to each other.
Well, it's interesting. You touched on the mystical Jewish belief that there's kind of only God, and of course that reminds me of panpsychism, which we touched on a little while ago in the conversation, and kind of this belief that all of reality is really this conscious layer. And I wonder if there's actually some convergence there from kind of a Kabbalistic perspective and kind of their view that really all that exists is our spirits, our souls, whatever the right term is, in this kind of godly environment. So I think there's interesting things to see of kind of how these things converge together. And I also love your concept around ethical striving and how AI is very different from at least the God that we imagine in the Western religions and probably similar to Eastern religions as well. So, kind of continue in this vein, how should people of faith apply AI within religion, within their spiritual lives? And is that even a good thing to entangle these two in some way?
Yeah, I think these things are entangled regardless, and I think they always have been. I mean, in addition to the big questions that AI gives rise to, which I mentioned before, which are essentially religious questions, religions have always embraced technological change. So when printing comes around, the religious people seize upon that to spread, religious information, and you can certainly see that, particularly within Christianity. In terms of spreading the gospel and the
Yeah.
good news and trying to convert people and missionarize and embracing AI in that way. I mean, you mentioned the use of VR to sort of meditate, and so religions have always been interested in capitalizing, and I think that will continue. But I also think that religions may also help us from absorbing AI or adopting every aspect of AI too readily. I may well help us sort of set up a kind of buffer between our humanity and the overall embrace, because ultimately one has to keep in mind that at the moment, at least, when we're embracing AI, we're actually embracing a commercial object, and there are
Yeah.
commercial actors behind that, and it's been invented for commercial reasons, at least primarily and mainly. And it's the commercial entities which are gathering information from our use of all these things. That always needs to be, at least for now, kept in the back of our minds. It can certainly enhance religious experience, but I would be very wary of that actually in terms of spirituality. And it's the same, I suppose, with taking drugs. Yes, of course, taking psychedelics can alter consciousness and give one an insight. But again, what it seems to be missing there is this ethical and effortful piece,
Yeah.
which is core to the religious experience. This kind of making ourselves into something different rather than allowing something to happen to us in a kind of passive sense. And I think that's the danger with AI. I think we may feel that it brings to some state where, in fact, what it should really be doing is helping us get to some state that we effortfully try and reach ourselves.
Yeah, going into one more level of depth here, especially since you're both a lawyer and a rabbi, obviously Judaism is so based on text study and interpretation, and so much of Jewish law is really debate and disagreement between various scholars and authorities about the meaning of these texts. And needless to say, Gen AI is quite good with text. It's quite good at reading text. It's quite good at asking questions about text. And I'm curious, like, as a rabbi, do you see this as more of an opportunity, more of a threat, more of a danger? Like, because in one way, like, especially from the Jewish perspective, it feels like there's a lot of value to have an AI in your chavruta, in your group of,
Yeah.
in your study group or things like that.
Right. So this is a great question. I think both of these things. I think on the one hand, it's amazing. I mean, they're already, Safaria is a database of Jewish text. It's growing by the day, and it's starting to employ AI in a slow way and in considered way. And I think it's an incredible resource. We're all getting more educated, and that's an incredible thing. Then the danger, I suppose, for established religion is that then what does that do to authority? When people become more knowledgeable, does that mean that authority is under attack? And yes, I think it will. I think it will mean that people are armed better when they are critiquing authorities, and I think that's a good thing. In terms of, you mentioned chavruta, which is this notion of having a study partner. I think that is a cool concept which AI can help with. You talk about VR technology. You could imagine, learning with a study partner or various study partners and having the text there in the background and experiencing some of the things that the text is talking about as one is learning and engaging in this in new ways, across continents. And that's an amazing thing. But going back to something that I said before, what I think it can't replace, and in a way we don't want it to replace, is the idea of making an effort and engaging with text. And if I may just expand upon this very slightly, within Judaism, there is a notion of arguing with God. I mean, the famous example of this is Abraham arguing with God on the fate of Sodom, this city that God wanted to destroy. But God felt that he had to consult with Abraham before doing that. And God was like, what on earth are you doing? And that question to me is relevant to AI in the sense that you have an individual which doesn't have as much knowledge as something else, but nevertheless being encouraged to confront that. And I think there's something of a model there when one approaches AI, because in fact, what we don't want to do is just accept everything that AI tells us or lays down for us. It's not offering the ultimate answers to life's questions. And in fact, when it does do that, we want to be in a position to push back against it. I could say quite a lot more about that, but I do think there's something in that model which we should be looking at kind of carefully.
I love that. And I have never heard anyone make that analogy before between Abraham disagreeing or arguing with God and AI. And we probably got to end it there because now we're going to have a whole new conversation about what does that even mean to argue with God and to use AI. I mean, that's fascinating. And I'm so grateful for your time. Before we wrap up here, we do have a few lightning round questions to ask you.
Okay.
So you'll have about 15 seconds to answer them. And the first one goes like this. What is your favorite personal use case for AI today?
I actually quite like the assistant. Yeah, I really do. I think it's great.
And do you have a favorite tool that you're using as your assistant?
Not really. I'm kind of experimenting, but I mean, I'm actually falling into the trap of using those that are most closely available to me.
Yeah.
And the danger, of course, is that that's exactly what the makers want me to do.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It is certainly an incumbent era because of the integrations that they do there. Next question. What are not enough people talking about in the realm of AI?
I think people are talking a lot about trust in AI and having AI in which we trust. And actually, I would like to see something different. I'd like to see a lack of trust and more of a questioning and critical approach to AI. And in terms of, what is this? Who has made this? What is happening to my information in relation to this? And what is it going to do to me as an individual and society as a whole? I think those are the questions we want to be asking, which I don't think we are.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the ones I wrote down from your comments earlier is really spending more time trying to dive into the difference between human intelligence and artificial intelligence, which I think will be important for us to answer as we look in the future. And then the last question here, would you personally want access to an AI priest or rabbi?
No, I wouldn't. I mean, I don't really hero worship generally anyway, and I'm kind of cynical in that respect. But I'd prefer actually an access to a faith that I'm not part of, in order to sort of question who I am already.
I love that. That is an amazing answer. Well, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a truly fascinating conversation, and I can't wait to continue it. And of course, thank you to all of our audience who join us again to engage with these important topics.
Well, Gilad, thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. Stay tuned to listen to more recordings and interviews with experts from around the world. In the meantime, follow and rate our podcast on your favorite podcast platform and share with your friends. Don't forget to follow us on our social media as well. We're on LinkedIn and X. Thank you for joining us today.